Hey everyone, today we are going to get to spend some time with one of my all time favorite Psalms, Psalm 90. So before we dig into the actual text of Psalm 90, I wanted to point out the superscript, which is simply a prayer of Moses, man of God. If you're not familiar with kind of the work behind these superscripts, these authorship things, they're a little messier than we would prefer as modern people. We're used to the idea of someone writes something, we put their name on it, no one else can claim it, copyright and all that. Um, in biblical times, they were a little messier. The fact that his name is on here, is associated with it, means Moses could have written it. It could have been inspired by Moses. They could have thought it was a good exemplar of his attitude or his life later on. So whatever his association with it is, um, the Holy Spirit felt it was important to connect this psalm with Moses and his life and the important things um, that he highlights for us. Whether that means he wrote it or was associated with it isn't quite as important. But one of the things I wanted to point out about this was this psalm is going to be largely about living life well, the good life. And Moses was considered kind of the proverbial good life. He lived 120 years. His life had three very distinct segments in it. He started out for 40 years as a prince of Egypt, as a mover and a shaker, with education, with a ton of money and influence, successful beyond most of our wildest dreams. And then he became a murderer, and he lived in exile. He lived dirt poor on the land as a shepherd, far away from his homeland for 40 years. And then finally, he was called by God to be part of some of God's most miraculous work in history of freeing the Israelites, parting the Red Sea, getting the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law, and leading a very stubborn and not particularly spiritual people who, of course, would be claimed by God, called the people of God. And so I was just struck by the fact that his life was considered the full life, the good life by most of the ancient world, particularly by God's people. And in a lot of ways, it looks the exact opposite of what we would expect from the good life. We want the good life to be, you kind of hit early success and then you kind of get to coast and retire and enjoy life at the end. And his life, I think, got harder in each stage and yet at the same time got richer. He knew God's presence better. And so I do think he lived the good life. And I think this psalm is going to teach us a little bit about how and about why. So let me start out with verses 1 and 2. O Master, you have been our abode in every generation. Before mountains were born, before you spawned earth and world, from forever to forever, you are God. So, something that is going to be really important for this psalm overall is it's going to talk about kind of the concept of God's time versus our time and God's perspective on history and our perspective on history. And in this one, it's pointing out two things. One, that God is utterly separated from history and from our time. He's self-contained. He's alone. He's from forever to forever. It simply is stated that you are God. You are apart, you are completely different than these things. But rather than that being something that's a little off putting, that makes God seem distant and too scary and powerful to relate to, it tells us right away, Master, you've been our abode, our sanctuary, our safe place from every generation. So, year after year, generation after generation, the people of God have discovered that God is like a lair or a hideout. He's something that's apart from the context. He's something that is apart from the daily problems we face, which can feel overwhelming so much of the time. So God is apart. He has a different perspective on how things are, but he's a safe place. He's a place we can turn to. He's a place where we can kind of get away and gain the perspective. And so that's going to be an important part of the rest of this psalm when we get into kind of how that's actually lived out. So the psalm continues in verse 3. You bring man back to the dust and say, turn back, humankind. For 1,000 years in your eyes are like yesterday gone, like a watch in the night. You engulf them with sleep. In the morn they are like grass that passes. In the morning it sprouts and passes. By evening it withers and dies. So I think we see in this section just the shortness of life, the fact that we only have so much time. Um, and I think for people who are in pain, people who, like many of the people who've read this over years, have been oppressed either politically or socially, this is really good news. God doesn't see the things of the world that are big and powerful, those things that are right in our face, that feel unstoppable, beyond us completely. God sees these as passing fads. He sees these as things that are big and strong and powerful, that are green as the grass, but even by this evening are going to fade and die away. And he's talking about, empires. He's talking about things that are utterly beyond our comprehension. And so, again, I think when you are in pain, that's really good news. This thing that is in our face, this thing that seems awful, is just going to last for a day. In God's perspective, it's going to fade away and be gone and not even remembered by history most of the time. On the other hand, if we find ourselves in a place of comfort, if we find ourselves influential, if we find ourselves the way the world works, working to our benefit, this can be a bit disturbing. These things we are used to, these things that feel normal to us and right and benefit us, are also going to dry up and fade away. We shouldn't rely on them. We shouldn't expect them to be there. They are not permanent. Sometimes they're a gift. Sometimes they mean we are living with something we shouldn't be. We're comfortable with something that is wrong. We're comfortable experiencing things that benefit us but don't necessarily benefit others. And those things too are going to dry up and fade away. So kind of depending on where you're at, this can be really comforting, this can be really disturbing. And we're going to see kind of in the next section the fact that if we don't have God's perspective on these things, life is going to be experienced pretty differently. And that's kind of the place that the writer of this psalm, whether it's Moses or someone else, is feeling at the moment. In the morning it sprouts and passes, and by evening it withers and dies. For we're consumed in your wrath, and in your fury we're dismayed. You have set our transgressions before you, our hidden faults in the light of your face. For all our days slip away in your anger. We consume our years like a sigh. The days of our years are but 70 years, and if in great strength 80 years. And their pride is trouble and grief, for swiftly cut down we fly off. Who can know the strength of your wrath, as the fear of you is your anger? To count our days rightly instruct, that we may get a heart of wisdom. So I think something that is really important in that description, it talks about sin, and I think it's talking about sin as a state, whether that's directly having done something wrong, whether that's directly you can point to moral failings, things that are wrong in our life, or if it's just living with a perspective that is less than God's. Those things are both twisted. Those value systems are both broken, and they're both expressions of, I think, what we see here. It feels like living under God's wrath. It feels like that drying heat that that just saps our strength. Every day feels hard and it feels like a slog. It feels like this never-ending thing, whereas God recognizes life is very quick. It's over very quickly. And so rather than relying on either our way of seeing life, of timing things, of valuing things, rather than relying on kind of our perspective and the way things feel, this person wisely is asking to know how to count our days rightly, to recognize God's perspective on it, to recognize that we need help actually enjoying and letting life be a blessing. Default and on our own, it's not. Life is a slog. It's hard. The days are short, they're hard, and they're nasty in a lot of ways. And so the image I think I had about using our days well from God's perspective, of being intentional about using them in kind of a spiritual way, was I remember when I was a kid and we used to go to arcades. Arcades to play video games was something we absolutely loved. And I remember we didn't have a ton of money, and so we'd always get these little rolls of quarters. We just had a couple of bucks to play with. So we knew every time we slotted one of those quarters into a machine, it was gone. We had one shot to try and keep ourselves alive in the video game as long as we could, right? And so I remember we always did the same thing. We held them in our hand. We walked around. We looked at every one of these machines. We tried to decide between which ones were the most expensive, which ones we were good at so we could play longer, which ones were just neat and new. We just didn't look at the first thing we saw and say, oh, I'll try that one because there might be a better one hiding in the corner, right? We only had so many quarters. We had to use them in the best way we could. We had to draw this thing out. And I think in a silly, childlike way, I think that's the way God wants us to approach our lives. There's so many things we could be doing. There's so many things that could hold our attention. There's so many people we could be spending our time with. And yet, like that handful of quarters, we have only so many days. The trickier part of that metaphor is we don't know how many we have, right? If I was holding those in my hand, I knew I had $2. I had 8 quarters. We don't have that luxury. And so we assume and we make some foolish choices by not taking God's perspective on things. We take our own. We kind of just drift along hoping things are going to work out. And I think that this person is saying, if we do that, we are going to experience life as something of a waste. We are going to feel like our days are hard, that they slip by, and we have nothing valuable to show for our days. We really need to recognize our limited time. We really need to recognize God's perspective and God's way of valuing things if we want to get the most out of each of these days. I think that this direct prayer is so important. We have to be taught perspective. We have to be taught correct values. We even have to be taught how to actually enjoy life, because we think we're enjoying life, and yet we discover so many times that what we're doing, what we're experiencing, is kind of empty, and we've wasted our time. We've wasted our day and our energy in those things that God has given us. So wisdom is always, in the Bible, perceived as a skill. It is something that takes practice. It is something that we are meant to hone and do well. We are supposed to be living into this skill of living life well, of making choices well, of keeping God's perspective, ultimately of living life in a way that pleases God well. That's what wisdom ultimately is. It's not head knowledge. It's a skill that we get by practice, and it's a skill that we get as a gift when we ask for it. And so that's exactly where this person, Moses or whoever, takes it after this. In verse 13, they say, "Come back, Lord. How long? Have pity on your servants. Sate us in the morn with your kindness. Let us sing and rejoice all our days. Give us joy as the days you afflicted us, the years we saw evil. Let your acts be seen by your servants, and your glory by your children. And may the sweetness of the Master our God be upon us, and the work of our hands firmly found for us, and the work of our hands firmly found." So there's a really specific ask in there. It says, God, come back. Let your presence be experienced by us, because life has felt empty, whether that's from, significant oppression or just actual suffering, or just this empty feeling that we've been experiencing. We're not told, because I think both of those can drive us to this. Lord, we need your presence. We need to experience your kindness so we can sing and rejoice, so we can understand kind of the daily sense of goodness. And I think that goes back to that first image, right? If God is our home, if God is our abode, he can teach us to enjoy the things that are in our circumstances. He can be enough even when the circumstances aren't very good. But we need his presence. We need to be taught how to do that. It's not something we can default to, particularly in times that are difficult, when circumstances aren't lining up the way we want them to. I think another really important thing of not just being taught to enjoy God's presence and the blessings there is this work of our hands. I think we were made to desire meaning, to do something with our lives that has a purpose. And I think we we prioritize incorrectly. We try and do things that may not be as important in the overall scheme of things in the kingdom, in God's long term plan, as we want them to be. We tend to want to be impressive and successful in one way or another, whereas God tends to use our gifts. God tends to use the things that we offer to Him in ways that are unexpected. He tends to use them in ways that do, in fact, add up to greater meaning, but they may not be the way we want them to. And we also have to admit the offerings we bring, the gifts we bring, really aren't that impressive to God. We are small, we have sin in our lives, we're selfish. And so I think of the image with this one of God making the work of our hands firmly founded. Um, God, we bring what we can and we ask that you do something with it. I think one of my favorite images that I connect with this is that little boy who brings a couple of loaves and fishes to Jesus. His little lunch is not nearly enough for the need, and yet Jesus makes it enough. He takes it, he multiplies it, and he feeds, the 5,000 and plus, women and children. He feeds this ginormous crowd with this tiny little thing the boy brought. It wasn't enough. It's just what he had. He brought it, and God drew it into his bigger story, and he made it enough. And I think that's what I think of with this. We are asking that God's presence and his sweetness be upon us, and the work of our hands be firmly founded. That only, I think, can happen by connection with his bigger story of taking our piddly little offerings and making them meaningful, connecting them with his bigger story, the flow of his kingdom and its growth in the world. And so Psalm 90, I think, is really beautiful. And what I was thinking about how we connect this with nowadays is I just think there's a lot of us feel many days that today's, our days right now are something of a slog. School is confusing. Work is hard. We're all at different ways waiting for COVID to go away, for things to kind of go back to normal. And many people are struggling with depression. Many people are just struggling right now with lack of work, etc., hoping things will just kind of go back to normal. And yet day after day after day seems to be sneaking away. And I think what I'm afraid of is we are going to miss the opportunity God's inviting us to, whether we know concretely what we're supposed to be doing or not. We only have so many days. We only have so many of those quarters to spend. And so are we asking for wisdom? Are we asking to invest where we can and how we can? Or are we just kind of waiting and hoping things will go back to normal? I think one of the things that's happened in so many people's lives is the emptiness of many of our routines have been exposed a little bit right now. We cannot keep ourselves busy. Our work may not feel as important or as meaningful as it did before now when we really weren't forced to look at it. And so I think we need to ask God again for a different pattern to define and give meaning to our days. We need to ask again for the wisdom to use our time well, our limited time, because without God's perspective, unless he is that abode, unless he gives us that perspective to focus on the things that are meaningful, to give those offerings and turn them into enough in the grander scheme of his kingdom, I think we are missing out on what he has for us. So Psalm 90, I think, can be an encouragement that this too shall pass. And I think it can be a spur to remind us that these days are not wasted, because nothing is wasted in God if we choose not to let it be wasted. And so I think we need to be asking very specific, Lord, instruct us, teach us your perspective that we may gain wisdom. And Lord, no matter what the circumstances are right now, we desire to experience your presence, to be taught how to enjoy life in the midst of anything right now. And I don't want to make light of the fact there is a lot of suffering in the world right now. Lord, despite that, we ask that you teach us to sing, to rejoice, to enjoy your presence. May the sweetness of the God our Master be around us. May we know it and enjoy it.